The amount of material I prepared is twice as much as we have actually discussed. And so I've cut out 25,000 words or something like that to my sorrow, most of the science. Still, I'm running over time, and I apologize for that. Your patience is greatly appreciated. This, to me, is such a serious issue that I just don't know how to make it much shorter. Given the incoming administration in the world, in the United States, I am really very concerned about nuclear weapons. And it had occurred to me that it might be useful to continue this next year with a discussion of both the hydrogen fusion bomb and some of the history of the Cold War and the politics. I don't know whether anybody would be interested, but if you would be, okay. But then I will, thank you, I will propose that. Thank you, that's very kind. What else? I guess that's about all. Oh, yes, I know. I like to add stories about these people because some of them I actually knew, and much of them there are many stories. And I promised to give you stories about Dick Feynman, which I haven't done, but two people have already asked me, so I'll start with that. Feynman was a very bright guy, but all these Nobel laureates are just astonishing. However, their personalities, from those I have met, and I've met quite a few, with almost no exception, are those of grade school children. They are full of jealousy and dislike and hatred. Oh, you mean him? He's a, and then off they go and give me a long diatribe about how awful their colleagues are. I mean, these are genius people I admire. Anyway, Feynman was a very young man at Los Alamos, but he was, of course, very talented. And one of the things he was able to do was open safes. And so all these secrets were locked up. Feynman would come along in the middle of the night, and he'd open a safe and leave a little note in saying Dick Feynman was here, and then close it again. And it used to drive the security people up the wall. The other thing he did, the Los Alamos was completely surrounded by a fence, of course. And it was a big fence. It's a fairly big mesa. And he found a hole in the fence. Whether he cut it or not, I don't know. And when you went in, you had to go in through guard gate, and there were guys with guns. He would drive a Jeep out through the hole, not signing out. Then he'd come back in, and he'd sign in and check in. And he had about 20 entries with no exits. He used to just made them. He was very good at doing that thing. Anyway. Let's get started. I want to talk about, the use today. To make explosives that were necessary for the implosion of the plutonium bomb, carefully machined lens molds had to be made, and they needed very good machinists because the tolerances were very tight. One of these machinists was a man from New York named David Greenglass. David Greenglass had a sister whose name was Ethel Rosenberg. Greenglass had been a member of the American Communist Party, but somehow that had escaped the notice of the security people, and he was there working on the Hill. He passed along information about the molds to his brother-in-law, Julius Rosenberg, and that went to the Soviet Union, of course. Greenglass and his fellow non-spy colleagues machined of the order of 20,000 molds for the development, and 1,000 kilograms of a high explosive was set off every day at Los Alamos to test this thing. By late March of '45, Oppenheimer said the design was good enough, no more changes. But everyone believed that they had to test this to see whether it really would go off. The B-29 had been made by Boeing, was the biggest and fastest bomber in the world at that time. It actually still had propellers for the few young people who may never have seen an airplane with propellers. But it had propellers. And the US Marines were working their way from island to island on the north, and they were invaded Saipan, the Mariana Islands, Saipan and Tinian, which were close enough to serve as bomber bases for the B-29, there being nothing but open ocean between those and the Japanese mainland, and they allowed then the Americans to begin bombing the Japanese mainland. But the Japanese had a ferocious reputation with the Americans because mostly they seemed to be willing to die rather than surrender. On Saipan, the Americans sustained 3,000 dead and 10,000 wounded. Almost all of the Japanese troops died. Even more horrible, apparently, thousands of Japanese civilians on the island committed suicide jumping off a cliff onto the rocks below, which both horrified the Americans, but also frightened them, because then they began to think, what's going to happen when we invade an island, the mainland islands, the major islands, with 100 million people population? And the idea that the invasion of the main islands of Japan would cost 1 million US casualties has always been used as one of the reasons for the atomic bombing. In the Pacific, the Japanese resistance increased even at Iwo Jima and then on Okinawa. On Iwo Jima, 20,000 Japanese troops died, 1,000 were captured. Unlike the sandy islands that the Marines had fought on previously, Iwo Jima is apparently a very rocky island. The troops were hidden in caves. The Americans invented these horrific things called flamethrowers, which would shoot jellied gasoline into caves and burn people to death. It was just horrific. In March 1945, a change in bombing strategy was created by General Curtis LeMay. At that time, over 300 B-29 bombers took off from Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. And each bomber, they could fly at low altitude because the Japanese had basically no air defense left. Each bomber had 180 100-pound jellied gasoline bombs on board. The total amount in modern parlance was equivalent to 2 kilotons of bombs. Okay, that's about 1/10 of an atom bomb. They flew on the 10th of March, arriving at Tokyo at 1 a.m. in the morning. Tokyo, of course, was full of wooden paper houses. They dropped these bombs on an area when the wind was blowing at about 25 kilometers per hour. Those of us who are in this area know what fires can do when the wind blows. They can also create a wind, and the fires that ensued created winds of over 100 kilometers an hour. An area of 40 square kilometers was completely destroyed. 100,000 people were killed, okay, in that one bombing raid. The U.S. continued this in the next 3 major Japanese cities, Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya, where over 150,000 people killed. These were generally civilians. They were not military areas. The slaughter of civilians had become a commonplace item. Even LeMay, who approved of this, actually not only did it, but approved it, thought was okay, said that had the U.S. lost the war, he would be tried as a war criminal. So he knew very well what was going on. Meanwhile, at Oak Ridge, the enrichment of uranium-235 was proceeding apace. Gaseous diffusion was used to create a product which was then put into calutrons and enriched even further. The enrichment was up to about 80%. Remember, normal ore has 0.7% of U-235. They enriched up to about 80%. Today, 90% is considered bomb-grade HEU, highly enriched uranium. Although the actual enrichment that the U.S. achieves today is classified, I was once told by somebody who works in this area that the percentage of U-238 left in the enriched fuel is less than the percentage of 235 in raw ore. That is, the 235 is greater than 99.3%. He wouldn't tell me what the real number was, but he was able to tell me that at least. In reactor fuel is ever so slightly enriched. It's about 2.5%, far too little to sustain a chain reaction. The U.S. began some serious intelligence gathering in Europe in late 1943. I'm sorry, 1944. Mostly this was due to Grove's obsession with security, because if a spy was to try to look for information about German success or progress, they would have to know something about radioactivity and about isotopes, and then if they were captured and tortured, they would release information that he did not want released. But eventually, somebody with some knowledge called this intelligence gathering operation Alsos, which is a Greek word meaning grove. When Groves found this out, he was very upset and very angry and tried hard to change it, but eventually gave up because everybody was using it. He was afraid, of course, Groves of security. He's crazy, man. The man he put in charge of this was a man from Army security named Boris Pash. Boris Pash was born Boris Paskovsky of Russian parents, but in San Francisco, where he was born. And he had been the man in the 30s to investigate Oppenheimer, and his conclusion was that Oppenheimer was definitely a Russian spy. Groves overrode that conclusion and appointed Oppenheimer anyway. But Pash was a very dogged man, even though he wasn't always very accurate. He was in France following the invasion, and entered Paris with the first American troops who followed the French because Roosevelt allowed de Gaulle and the French army to liberate the city. And then he went on to Strasbourg, again following the French, and he had with him his chief scientific advisor, Samuel Goldschmidt. I mentioned Goldschmidt earlier. He was at the University of Michigan, where he helped Fermi learn English. He was a Dutch Jew who had come to the United States as early as 1927, but his parents stayed back in Holland, where they were later deported and murdered. He was along with Pash in Strasbourg, and as the Nazis were such good record keepers, he was able to find all the details about where his parents were sent, when they were murdered, how they were murdered, etc., which was on his father's 70th birthday. He also discovered in Strasbourg that the Nazis were nowhere close to making an atomic bomb and had not even done a reactor pile. And such paper knowledge was okay for Groves, but not nearly sufficient, because he wanted to know what had happened with all the uranium ore that the Nazis had collected when they invaded Belgium. Pash had already discovered 31 tons of ore in Toulouse, and then he and his people were able to discover all the rest in a town in Germany. Then he rushed down to the Black Forest with a sizable group of soldiers, where he found all of the German scientists, because he was interested not only in getting all the ore, but he also wanted to keep all the scientists away from the Russian army who was advancing from the east. They've also found there what the Germans had accomplished in terms of making a reactor, and I want to read you what he wrote. What eager reports we had prior to the Alsos mission discoveries tended to indicate an active German project. These reports were erroneous. The Germans were in fact doing very little and had not even devised, let alone constructed, a self-reacting pile. Remember, that was necessary to prove that there's a chain reaction before you can build a bomb. In fact, the kind of reports we received early on indicate either an active disinformation project or, as I think to be an actual fact, simply the judgment of people knowledgeable about the early work in Germany as to what the Germans must be doing given the early start they had in the area and their interest in the Belgian uranium supplies. So Alsos was collecting information. The Nazis had no work at all. The Americans had these enormous reactors going at Hanford, Washington, making plutonium on a regular basis, and had all diffusion and calutron plants going, enriching uranium at Oak Ridge. And in fact, all 31 tons of German uranium ore were already at Oak Ridge being purified. The Americans also captured all of the German scientists, including Werner Heisenberg, and sent them off to an isolated farm in Britain. On the 12th, at Los Alamos, Otto Frisch was the head of the Critical Assemblies Division at Los Alamos, and it was their job to determine what a critical mass of uranium really was. And that's a pretty dangerous job, because what it meant was putting pieces of uranium-235 together, seeing how it reacted, and not blowing up the entire area and killing everybody on it. Dick Feynman called this tickling the tail of the dragon. And although there were there was a scary time when Frisch himself put too much together, and he got about something like a week's or a month's radiation dose in a few seconds, but it didn't kill him. Frisch's result was that more than one critical mass would be necessary. On the 12th of April in 1945, Frisch completed his studies of the critical mass assembly. George Kistiakowsky reported that the calculation, he had finished, of course, the design of the implosion method, and the calculations of what people had said agreed with what they had measured, and so that was ready to go as well as it was. This was the 12th of April, 1945. On that very day, Franklin Roosevelt suffered a massive stroke and died. And I remember that day very well, because I was listening to my favorite cowboy program on the radio, and to my intense annoyance, it was interrupted by an announcement that the president had died, and I was quite angry with him for dying during Tom Mix. Truman, who had become vice president in 1944, was now sworn in as president, and Bush and Conan thought it a propitious time to approach Stimson, and through him the president, about some version of Bohr's vision of the future. Bohr's ideas about the control of the bomb were floating around Washington, but there was great fear of Stalin, and a lot of information was given to Truman about what the intelligence agencies knew. Unlike the incoming person in Washington today, Truman did not consider himself intelligent enough that he did not need intelligence. Bohr had proposed that only an open world, modeled in some sense after the way that science actually works, could deal with the existence of this new weapon. Vannevar Bush had changed this idea to a proposal for an international pool of science research. And then he passed that idea along, as I said, to Stimson. Stimson thought it inadvisable to do anything until they got Russian agreement for political liberalization in Russia in exchange for the knowledge. But that kind of liberalization is the outcome of open communication, and so he had it exactly backward. And what was happening, of course, by politics was a watering down of, continual watering down of Bohr's original idea. But a long memo was presented by Stimson and Groves to Truman, telling him about the progress on the bomb and what was happening, because he had no idea before this. And they also proposed a special select committee to be informed, to be created to advise both the executive and the legislature branches of government about what this new science pretended for humanity. It was clear that, I mean, this is now April 45, the war was over, VE Day was in May. It was clear the war was over in Europe and well before there would be a bomb available. But not so, of course, in the Pacific, and most people thought that the entry of the Soviet Union to the war could hasten the end of the war. That idea changed rapidly, at the same time, B-29 bombers were being modified to carry a single bomb, and in particular, in the case of the Fat Man bomb, it was bigger and heavier than any particular bomb. So the planes had to be modified, and a man named Paul Tibbets and a large number of airmen were being trained to fly. Now, way back in March of 1944, I want to introduce a British physicist named Joseph Rotblat. Rotblat was a very brilliant young man, and he had been living in Liverpool, where he was working with James Chadwick. He was born in Poland, but had come to England to work and study. He came to Los Alamos along with the British team. And he was living, because his room wasn't ready in the bachelor quarters, he was living in Chadwick's house. Chadwick was the head of the British team and as such in contact with Oppenheimer and Groves and so forth. And Groves liked Chadwick and used to come and talk to him. And so Rotblat got to listen in to these conversations. And, but while he was still in England, he had gone back to Poland, to Warsaw, in August of, late August of '39, to get his wife and bring her back. She was ill with appendicitis, and so he had to go back to England and said, well, you'll be better in a week or two, then you come. This was late August, of course. On the 1st of September, the Nazis invaded Poland. She was trapped in Warsaw and murdered, and he never saw her again, and of course never remarried. But here Rotblat is now Rotblat in Los Alamos is sitting in Chadwick's house. Groves comes to visit, and he hears Groves say, of course, the real purpose in making the bomb was to subdue the Soviets. And that shocked the hell out of Rothblatt, not surprisingly, because at this time, now we're talking March 44, there was no second front in Europe. The Soviets were doing all the fighting and dying and driving the Germans out of Russia. The Americans and the Brits were slowly moving up what Churchill laughingly called the soft underbelly of Europe in the Italian peninsula. And although Rothblatt, of course, had no love for the Soviets because they had invaded Poland, and the Poles have a long history of disliking the Russians, still he was deeply shocked. And he had also had many discussions with Niels Bohr, with whom he was quite friendly. As he asked then to leave Los Alamos because it was clear that the bomb would not be ready for use against the Germans, and that was the ostensible reason that he was told that it was being built. And so he was the only person to leave Los Alamos. He decided that any work in physics that he might do in the future, and this guy was very smart, would have practical applications, some of which could well be deleterious. And so he decided to work in nuclear physics as it applies to medical research. And he was quite successful at that. And it is a very useful field, as any of us who have ever had an X-ray or an MRI or an NMR, or sometimes it's called MRI, sometimes it's called NMR, depending on what country you live in, or a CAT scan, or any of these things, all of which were invented by physicists. He went on to convince Albert Einstein and Bertrand Russell to form the Pugwash movement for nuclear disarmament, and he went on to became the director. And in 1995, Pugwash and Rothblatt shared the Nobel Prize for Peace. He died in 2005 in London at the age of 97, working every day. Since I belonged to Pugwash, I met him several times. It took over 10 years to go through his papers because he was not a very tidy person, and his desk was about that high in paper all over. But he was not entirely correct when he said that nobody else was interested in the social problems, because at Los Alamos, where people were working day and night for the construction of the bomb, there were questions arising in late 44. Robert Wilson, who was the head of the experimental physics division and who then went on to build and operate the accelerator called Fermilab, which was then the biggest physics accelerator in the world before the one at CERN was built. He went to Oppenheimer in late 44 and proposed a formal meeting on the possible uses of this new weapon. Oppenheimer discouraged him, saying he would get in trouble with the security people, and he ignored that and instead advertised a meeting about whether it was called the impact of the gadget on civilization. The word bomb and weapon was forbidden for security reasons, and so the bomb was called the gadget. And some 20 of the top people attended, including Oppenheimer, and they discussed whether this country is doing the right thing and using the weapon on real live human beings. Oppenheimer argued that scientists had no greater right to talk about the use of their discoveries than any other citizen, and that this bomb might end all wars. He made the argument that the war could not end without people knowing of the might of the new weapon. And his word carried great weight, where people generally thought of him as fair and honest. He had rather a magnetic attraction for people, with the exception of a few like Neddermeyer. Farther removed from Los Alamos, there was even more such activity, particularly at the University of Chicago, where there was related bomb work. James Franck, James Franck, was a Nobel laureate in 1925, but again, as a Jewish physicist, had to leave Germany, and it was one of the Nobel medals that was dissolved in acid in Copenhagen and saved throughout the war. Franck drafted this petition for effective international control and presented it to what was called the scientific panel of the interim committee that had been formed to consider the bomb's use. This committee, which originally had nothing but administrators and politicians on it, but both Bush and Conant thought that we should have a few scientists. So Arthur Compton, Ernest Lawrence, Robert Oppenheimer, and Enrico Fermi were added. The petition was signed by Franck, of course, Leo Szilard, and a lot of other fairly distinguished people. It goes on. No limit to the destructive force, and that is true, which will become available. The first steps in this direction. The war in Europe by this time, of course, was over, and the petition discussed then the potential use against Japan. And it proposed a postponement of use, or at worst a demonstration, so that the public could be aware of the danger that this new weapon presented, and the creation of maybe some sort of international control to be at least publicly discussed. 5 days later, the scientists on the interim committee gave a report. And it's clear from the language that Oppenheimer's influence was very great, because they recommended that we see no acceptable alternative to direct military use. General Groves said later that any idea that scientists might even have a veto on the use of the bomb was pure poppycock. The decision was military and political. The bomb was to be detonated before it hit the ground, with the optimum height a matter of discussion. Too high, and it would blast mostly air. Too low, and it would dig a big crater in the ground, and its force would be diminished. The estimate for the bomb, for Little Boy, was between 5,000 and 15,000 tons of TNT. It turned out to be the latter number almost exactly. The explosive effect of the plutonium bomb was anyone's guess. It turned out to be 22,000 tons of TNT. It was clear the uranium bomb would work. The plutonium bomb, of course, needed a test, and they had enough plutonium for one test and one actual weapon. Several cities had been spared firebombing in Japan so that the effects of a nuclear bomb could be properly assessed. These cities were Kyoto, Hiroshima, Yokohama, and Kokura. Kokura was a major weapons area for manufacture and storage. Yokohama is on Tokyo Bay, close to the capital. The other cities are much farther to the west. At the interim committee meeting on the 18th of May, the Bush-Conant memo had been presented, and it had some of Bohr's ideas still in it. Now, James Burns, Jimmy Burns as he was called, had been appointed by Truman as Secretary of State in his new administration, and he was clearly intrigued by and impressed with what was stated in the memo. And what and the memo said that the Soviets will have a bomb within 3 to 4 years, which was exactly true. They exploded an identical copy of Little Boy in 1949. And I'm taking too long, but that bomb was an identical copy. And it was an identical copy because the equivalent to Groves in the Soviet Union was a man named Lavrenti Beria. And those of us who know anything about the history of the Soviet Union, Beria was a dreaded character, the head of the secret police and the murderer of thousands and thousands of people. And so clearly the Soviet scientists worked under considerable pressure. By 1949, Kurchatov, who was a very bright man, the equivalent of Oppenheimer, and it is interesting that both he and Oppenheimer became greatly opposed to the use of nuclear weapons in the 50s. But Kurchatov knew how to build a better bomb. Lavrenti said, this bomb better work or else, and so it will be an exact copy because we know that works. And so that's what they did. Burns was convinced that the decision about what to do depended on how long it would take the Soviets to build the bomb, because he was a very political person. Well, the petition said 3 to 4 years. Groves was furious. 20 years, he said. And that changed Burns' mind. What nobody knew was, of course, that the Soviets had detailed drawings of how to make the bomb. They knew everything, thanks to the spies they had there. And Churchill, again, was so virulently anti-Soviet that he was unable to understand what a change in world politics this weapon would make. Leo Szilard was becoming ever more desperate, and in April of 45, he prepared a memo for Franklin Roosevelt, who was still president, and he got Einstein to sign it. He wasn't allowed to show the letter to Einstein because Einstein was outside the military, but Einstein agreed to sign it. He took it to Eleanor Roosevelt. She took it, she met him on the 8th of April, 45, and arranged for him to meet Franklin Roosevelt, who was dead by the time of the meeting. Szilard was kind of adrift and didn't know what to do. But then he realized that one of the people who worked for him in Chicago had come from Kansas City, as did Harry Truman. Kansas City was under the domination of a very strong political boss. This young kid who worked for Szilard had worked for the political boss, and therefore Szilard thought this kid and the political boss could get him in to see Truman. And it did work, and he had a meeting with Truman within 3 days, which Truman canceled and sent Szilard off to South Carolina to talk to Jimmy Burns. And this is his petition. Japan, knowing these terms, refuses to surrender. And it went on to say, whoops, I thought it went on to say, no, anyway. The petition mentions the certainty that other nations will make such weapons, and all of the cities in the world will be in continuous danger of being annihilated. And this, of course, is a very prescient agreement, a document, because it laid out some of the problems we've all faced for the last 70 years. Now, Szilard was not the most diplomatic of people, and he started off the discussion with Burns by insulting him, by saying, well, I know you're a smart guy, but you're not a scientist, and so you really won't understand what I'm saying, but here's what I'm saying. Not a very wise thing to do. And Burns later wrote that Szilard made a very, very bad impression on him. Szilard also, of course, was ignorant of the situation. He was indeed, because he said that Groves had told him that the Soviets could not build a bomb because they did not have a source of high-grade uranium. Well, that's an untrue statement, because you don't need a source of high-grade uranium, you just need uranium. And in the mountains of Kyrgyzstan, in fact, I have visited the uranium mines that the Russians used, they left these gigantic tailings of stuff which now are leaching down into the lake at the bottom, which supplies drinking water for the country, and so people are drinking radioactive water in that country. The target committee that was discussing things had decided that the prime target should be Kyoto, with then Hiroshima and Kokura as the choice targets. Henry Stimson was 77 years old at the time, was Secretary of War, and an educated man and very unhappy about the responsibilities he faced. He really did not condone LeMay's firebombing of Japanese cities, and even as Secretary of War, he was unable to prevent that. Anyway, on the 30th of May in 45, Groves came to Stimson to talk about something. Stimson said, "Stop. I want to know what the results of the target committee are." Groves said, I'll take that information to General Marshall, whose office is around the corner, tomorrow. Stimson said, "I'm the boss. I want to see it, and I want to see it now." And so Groves was not pleased, but he went back, of course, and he got it. And he showed, and he said, "Kyoto is the preferred target." Stimson said, in no uncertain terms, "I do not want Kyoto bombed." He told Groves that Kyoto was the former capital of Japan and the cultural center of the country and would not be destroyed. The two men then got up, walked around the corner into George Marshall's office, and he repeated, "I do not want Kyoto bombed," and it wasn't. He had written that this new weapon may destroy international civilization, may be either Frankenstein or a means for world peace. But by the end of May, Bush and Conant had argued for a major investment in nuclear arms and a considerable expansion of the current system. And this was, of course, a prescription for the arms race which followed, and as soon as the Soviets made their own bomb. The plants for producing the materials at Oak Ridge and at Hanford were to be expanded. That is the Oak Ridge, part of the Oak Ridge plant, and that's part of the Hanford, Washington plant. These plants were so big that they were as big as the entire U.S. auto industry at the beginning of the war. This was very serious investment. Now, Oppenheimer had argued that scientists have no more right than anybody else, but he also argued that, look, the fundamental knowledge of the physics behind their work is so well known throughout the world that early steps should be taken to make this development known to the rest of the world. It would be wise, he argued, for the U.S. to offer the world free interchange of information with particular emphasis on the development of peacetime uses. At Los Alamos, there was a man who had come with a British delegation named Klaus Fuchs. Fuchs was a very, very intelligent and dedicated scientist. He had originally been stationed at Oak Ridge, where he learned a lot about both diffusion and calutrons, and then he was transferred to the theory division at Los Alamos, again because Edward Teller refused to work on that. The theory division was busy designing the implosion device for the plutonium bomb. He took several trips from the lab, during which he met Soviet agents and passed information, detailed information, including drawings and specifications to the Soviets. He was undetected. He returned to Britain in 1946 and became associate director of Harwell, the laboratory which designed the British bombs. And he informed the Soviets there also about British progress. In 1950, with virtually no evidence against him, he made a full confession to the police because he was becoming disenchanted, if you will, with the Soviet regime. He was, of course, arrested, stripped of British citizenship, and sentenced to 15 years in prison. He served 9 and then was released, went directly to East Germany, where he worked on nuclear fission in East Germany, and then died in 1979. He named an American contact, Harry Gold. Gold was also the contact for Julius Rosenberg. Rosenberg, of course, was married to Ethel Rosenberg, and Ethel's brother was David Greenglass. Greenglass was arrested in June of 1950, and he immediately implicated his brother-in-law Julius. He denied that his sister Ethel had anything to do with the situation. But just before their trial in early 1951, he changed his testimony and said that Ethel had typed up the notes he passed along, and thereby implicating her, of course, as well. Greenglass was convicted and sentenced to 15 years. Ethel and Julius were sentenced to death and duly executed. Greenglass was released in 1960 after serving 9 years, and he lived in New York with his wife Ruth under an assumed name. In the 90s, in his 70s, he recanted much of his testimony and stated that his sister had done nothing and that his wife had retyped the notes, but that he had implicated his sister to save his wife, who had been indicted but not convicted. Who knows what the truth really is. But it, of course, is due to Fuchs and Greenglass that Stalin knew more and earlier about the bomb than did Harry Truman. Fission weapons are limited in explosive force because the chain reaction causes heat and pressure so much that the bomb expands before all the uranium in it has time to fission. Much of the material never really participates. The bomb which destroyed Hiroshima was 2% efficient, which means that 98% of the U-235 in that bomb never fissioned. 2% of it fissioned. Okay, but the bomb had several critical masses in it, and it was that big, the size of a football. 2% of that is the amount that fissioned. That's how big. That killed 70,000 people. It weighed 900 grams. Because uranium is dense. Okay. Given that much uranium, you and I could blow up Cape Town. Okay. It's shocking to me, absolutely shocking. Now, Kenneth Bainbridge from Harvard was put in charge of the test effort for the plutonium bomb. He had a staff of more than 250 technical people and an untold number of military and construction workers. After surveying many sites, the site they decided on was a desert site in New Mexico called the Jornada del Muerte, or the Trail of Death. And it was the name was picked for 2 reasons: because it was a desolated and very dry area, and also because Indian and Spanish settlers had been pushed out by Americans a century before, and they had had to travail through that area, many of them dying because there is no water. Ground Zero, a steel tower about 30 meters high, was built and built upon a 6-meter deep concrete base to make it very, very strong. Reinforced observation stations were set up 6 miles and 10 miles away. That's the bomb that was tested. Pretty big. There's it being winched up into the tower. The site was called Trinity, and The name Trinity was given to it by Oppenheimer from John Donne's Holy Sonnets. I'm not sure if I mentioned that before. There's the tower, and the bomb is already up at the top. There was a graduate student whose job was to sit there all night to make sure that nothing happened. He said, I would never know if it went off, so it didn't matter. And he wouldn't, of course. And the reason he was scared is because there was a storm and there were lightning bolts all over the place. There's a picture of a plutonium bomb and what it is. Inside is the neutron initiator, the thing to generate the initial neutrons, still classified. Around it is the plutonium core. Around that is a uranium tamper. And the purpose of that is that the neutrons, some of the neutrons escape. The uranium, being heavy, reflects them back in. And so it increases the number of neutrons. And then around it are all these other things, fast and slow explosives, and then electric sparks to set things off. And that's the whole business. The meeting at Potsdam had originally been scheduled for the 6th of June, but Truman postponed it until the 15th of July so that the Trinity test could take place and he could report the results if it worked, if indeed it worked. This meant that Groves and Oppenheimer were desperate for the test to take place, and the tension was very great. On the 15th of July, the weather was bad, and that's very unusual in New Mexico in the summertime. There were storms, but they were predicted to end about dawn, and indeed they did end, and the bomb was detonated at 5 hours, 29 minutes, and 45 seconds on Sunday, the 15th of July, 1945, and it worked. 6 milliseconds after detonation, 25 milliseconds after detonation. There's 100 meters, 53 milliseconds after detonation. The reactions of people at Trinity were mixed, mostly shock, happy that it worked, awed by what they had unleashed, and frightened. Fermi, who is a master of simple things, had a handful of paper scraps, and when the blast wave reached him 6 miles away, he let them go and measured how far they flew and said, minimum 10 kilotons. I mean, he was a really smart guy. There are recorded reactions both from Oppenheimer and Bainbridge. Oppenheimer being this famous words from the Bhagavad Gita, Kenneth Bainbridge being more realistic. Now, whether Oppenheimer really said this or not is of some debate, because he had a brother, Frank, who is also a physicist, and Frank said, all he said at the time was, it worked. And these words were written down in 1948, but I don't know what the reality is. Oppenheimer and Groves visited the site somewhat later, and that's the tower. The sand here was fused rock, a blue rock, which has come to be called trinitite, and for a number of years it was sold as a souvenir. You could go on the 15th of July, they opened this site for tourists, and you could buy a chunk of trinitite. They stopped doing that when they found trinitite was in fact radioactive. 4 hours after the bomb, the heavy cruiser Indianapolis sailed from San Francisco to Tinian, and it had on it the shell and the bullet of Little Boy on board. Tinian at that time had the largest airport in the world, 6 runways, 3,000 meters long. American intelligence had picked up some information messages between Tokyo and Moscow from the Japanese ambassador to attempt to get the Soviets to mediate a surrender. But the Americans, and this is a consequence of what had happened in the First World War, and an unhappy one, the Americans demanded that both the Germans and the Japanese unconditionally surrender. At Versailles in 1919, the Germans had been forced to surrender, but not unconditionally. And what happened in the next 20 years, which the US and particularly the UK were very sensitive to, was blamed on the fact that the surrender was not unconditional. And so both the German and the Japanese had to surrender unconditionally. Anyway, again, Truman was now under pressure to finish the war before the Soviets got involved, because they didn't want, everybody was worried about Stalin. Stimson was at Potsdam and got the following telegram. Operated on this morning, that it worked. Results seem satisfactory, exceeded expectations. Local press release necessary. And what this meant was they could see this thing hundreds of miles away. It was dark, and suddenly it was dawn, and then it got dark again. So people noticed, hundreds of miles away. Dr. Groves is pleased. Yes, Groves was very pleased. At Potsdam, of course, Truman then told Stalin that we had the weapon and tested it. Stalin was nonplussed, to say the least. He certainly knew about the bomb. He probably even knew about the Trinity test, because Fuchs was there. On the 18th of July, Groves drafted a directive to release the bomb for military use, and he sent it for approval to Marshall and Stimson. On the 26th of July, the Indianapolis reached the Tinian, and cargo planes left New Mexico carrying the uranium pieces for the bomb and the plutonium core for Fat Man. Now, one of the things that contributed to the fate of the bombing was this cruiser Indianapolis, because she delivered the material and then sailed off to Guam, and then was on its way to the Philippines for training before returning to Okinawa to participate in the invasion of Japan. The Japanese surface fleet and Air Force had been completely destroyed, and so ships were able to sail without escort. The Indianapolis, however, was an old ship and didn't even have sonar for the detection of submarines, and a Japanese submarine fired 6 torpedoes, all of which hit. And on the 29th of July at night, the ship exploded and went quickly down. There were 1,200 men on board. 850 escaped into the water, the rest drowned. Somehow, nobody noticed its disappearance for 4 days, and it wasn't until a surveillance plane on the 2nd of August noticed that there were people floating in the water. Of the 850 crew who had made it into the water, 318 men were still alive, the rest dying of exposure, and many eaten by sharks. In his 6-volume history of the Second World War, Churchill wrote the following: "The overwhelming power, at the cost of a few explosions, seemed, after all our toils and perils, a miracle of deliverance." Well, it sure didn't seem a miracle of deliverance to the people of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. The bomb was used not because the Japanese would not surrender, but because the Japanese would not surrender unconditionally. On Tinian, the little boy was ready on the 31st of July, and the bomb lacked only the cordite charge which would explode the bullet. For safety reasons, that would only be inserted once the plane was in the air, because they didn't want it blowing up on the ground. The crew, Tebbett's crew, had practiced flying to Hiroshima, had dropped a fake bomb, had made the turn they had to make, special turn to escape the blast, and had flown back. 7 planes were due to fly. 3 weather planes to fly ahead and check the weather, 3 observation planes behind, but 1 plane carrying 1 bomb was important. The Navy officer who inserted the cordite charge was Deke Parsons, who had been in charge of the Ordnance Division at Los Alamos. Tibbets had his plane painted with the name of his mother, the Enola Gay. That's his crew. Parsons is not here. Made them. He was very good at doing that thing. Anyway, let's get started. I want to talk about, the use today. To make explosives that were necessary for the implosion of the plutonium bomb, carefully machined lens molds had to be made, and they needed very good machinists because the tolerances were very tight. One of these machinists was a man from New York named David Greenglass. David Greenglass had a sister whose name was Ethel Rosenberg. Greenglass had been a member of the American Communist Party, but somehow that had escaped the notice of the security people, and he was there working on the Hill. He passed along information about the molds to his brother-in-law, Julius Rosenberg, and that went to the Soviet Union, of course. Greenglass and his fellow non-spy colleagues machined of the order of 20,000 molds for the development, and 1,000 kilograms of a high explosive was set off every day at Los Alamos to test this thing. By late March of '45, Oppenheimer said the design was good enough, no more changes. But everyone believed that they had to test this to see whether it really would go off. The B-29 had been made by Boeing, was the biggest and fastest bomber in the world at that time. It actually still had propellers for the few young people who may never have seen an airplane with propellers. But it had propellers. And the U.S. Marines were working their way from island to island on the north, and they were invaded Saipan, the Mariana Islands, Saipan and Tinian, which were close enough to serve as bomber bases for the B-29, there being nothing but open ocean between those and the Japanese mainland, and they allowed then the Americans to begin bombing the Japanese mainland. But the Japanese had a ferocious reputation with the Americans because mostly they seemed to be willing to die rather than surrender. On Saipan, the Americans sustained 3,000 dead and 10,000 wounded. Almost all of the Japanese troops died. Even more horrible, apparently, thousands of Japanese civilians on the island committed suicide jumping off a cliff onto the rocks below, which both horrified the Americans, but also frightened them, because then they began to think, what's going to happen when we invade an island, the mainland islands, the major islands, with 100 million people population? And the idea that the invasion of the main islands of Japan would cost them. I promised to give you stories about Dick Feynman, which I haven't done, but 2 people have already asked me. So I'll start with that. Feynman was a very bright guy. But, all these Nobel laureates are just astonishing. However, their personalities, from those I have met, and I've met quite a few, with almost no exception, are those of grade school children. They are full of jealousy and dislike and hatred. Oh, you mean him? He's a, and then off they go and give me a long diatribe about how awful their colleagues are. I mean, these are genius people I admire. Anyway, Feynman was a very young man at Los Alamos, but he was, of course, very talented. And one of the things he was able to do was open safes. And so all these secrets were locked up. Feynman would come along in the middle of the night and he'd open a safe and leave a little note in saying Dick Feynman was here, and then close it again. And it used to drive the security people up the wall. The other thing he did, the Los Alamos was completely surrounded by a fence, of course. And it was a big fence. It's a fairly big mesa. And he found a hole in the fence. Whether he cut it or not, I don't know. And when you went in, you know, you had to go in through guard gate, and there were guys with guns. He would drive a Jeep out through the hole, not signing out. Then he'd come back in and he'd sign in and check in. And he had about 20 entries with no exits. Used to just million U.S. casualties has always been used as one of the reasons for the atomic bombing. In the Pacific, the Japanese resistance increased even at Iwo Jima and then on Okinawa. On Iwo Jima, 20,000 Japanese troops died, 1,000 were captured. Unlike the sandy islands that the Marines had fought on previously, Iwo Jima is apparently a very rocky island. The troops were hidden in caves. The Americans invented these horrific things called flamethrowers, which would shoot jellied gasoline into caves and burn people to death. It was just horrific. In March 1945, a change in bombing strategy was created by General Curtis LeMay. At that time, over 300 B-29 bombers took off from Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. And each bomber, they could fly at low altitude because the Japanese had basically no air defense left. Each bomber had 180 100-pound jellied gasoline bombs on board. The total amount in modern parlance was equivalent to 2 kilotons of bombs. Okay, that's about 1/10 of an atom bomb. They flew on the 10th of March, arriving at Tokyo at 1 a.m. in the morning. The amount of material I prepared is twice as much as we have actually discussed. And so I've cut out 25,000 words or something like that to my sorrow, most of the science. Still, I'm running over time, and I apologize for that. Your patience is greatly appreciated. This, to me, is such a serious issue that I just don't know how to make it much shorter. Given the incoming administration in the world, in the United States, I am really very concerned about nuclear weapons. And it had occurred to me that it might be useful to continue this next year with a discussion of both the hydrogen fusion bomb and some of the history of the Cold War and the politics. I don't know whether anybody would be interested, but if you would be, okay. But then I will. Thank you. I will propose that. Thank you. That's very kind. What else? I guess that's about all. Oh, yes, I know. I like to add stories about these people because some of them I actually knew, and much of them there are many stories, and I haven't.